Good evening, everyone. So in the last session, we have seen the concepts, what is different types of methods, how to write different methods, how to pass arrays, how to pass objects to a method, as well as we have seen one polymorphism concept, method overloading, right? In the method overloading, we can overload a same method in a same class with different type signatures, that is the number of parameters or data types. Okay, so this is a compile time polymorphism and it gets resolved at the compilation time itself. We have seen this method overloading example also. We have created add method, different add methods with different type signatures, number of parameters, type of parameters are different, etc. Okay, and how to call these methods, how it gets resolved at a compile time, that we have already seen in the last session. Today we are going to see the next point, that is constructor. We have seen what is class and object, right? So constructor is also important while learning Java. Okay, constructors are nothing but it is kind of a method itself. It is a piece of code, usually a special method we say, whose name is the same as the class name. Okay, whenever we are creating any class, we are creating a constructor. Whenever we are creating any object using a new keyword and we are using the parenthesis like this with a class name itself, this is nothing but a constructor. Okay, so the constructor is nothing but a special method whose name is same as the class name. Constructors are used for initializing objects. They are called just after the object creation. Okay, so what is mean by this initializing objects? When we want to give some values to any instance variables, default values, any other values, then we use the constructor to initialize the objects, or we are constructing an object with the help of constructor. Okay, so it is not compulsory every time to define a constructor in a class. But if you don't define a constructor in your Java class, then the default constructor with no parameter will be created itself by the JVM or by the compiler. Here we have seen this example, many examples when we are creating any object. So this type of constructor we have not mentioned, we have not added in our this class method overloading example. But still we are calling this constructor to construct our M object. We are basically saying the compiler constructor M object with the default values. Okay, so we have not mentioned this, or we have not defined this constructor in our class. Who is creating this? So the basically compiler creates this by default if you are not defining any constructor in your class. Okay, so if you are not defining any constructor in your class, then the default constructor with no parameter will be created itself by the JVM or by the compiler. So syntax of creating a constructor or defining a constructor is class, class name, access modifier, constructor name. Constructor name always has same name as a class name. Then the parameters, this is optional, okay, and the body of a constructor, whatever you want to perform to while constructing an object, then you can add that thing here in the body of a constructor. Points to remember about a constructor. We will see how to write a constructor. Okay, but first, points to remember about the constructor. Constructor must have the same name as that of class name. Okay, that means if you are creating a student class, then you must write down the constructor should be with the student as the name of that class. Okay, it doesn't have any return type. Okay, so it will never return any value. It will always have only access modifiers. That can be different access modifiers we can specify. A constructor is used to create and initialize the object. So whenever we want to create an object by a new keyword, then JVM internally invokes this constructor. I have already explained that. Okay, every time an object is created, using a new keyword, at least one constructor should be called. Okay, we are using a new keyword to create an object. That means we are initializing the object, the memory gets allocated for the object. That time we must have to call one constructor, at least one constructor. If you are using the blank parenthesis, default constructor gets called by JVM internally. Okay, if you are not defining that. Then every class has a default constructor by default that provides by the Java compiler that I already explained. Constructors are automatically chained by using this keyword. We are going to see what is this keyword and how to use it. Okay. And the super keyword. Super keyword we are going to learn while we are going to learn the concept inheritance. Okay. Now with the constructors, we are going to learn this keyword. Okay. Like a method, we can overload constructors in Java as it is a same special method itself, right? We have seen it that it is a special method, right? It is a special method. That's why as a method overloading, we can overload constructors as well. Okay. Java constructors cannot be abstract, static, final, and synchronized. These are the non-access modifiers. Basically, we are going to learn all these one by one later. So just remember that Java constructors, we cannot give these non-access modifiers to constructors. Constructors never have the return type. It doesn't return any value. It will always use to initialize the object to give some value to the object instance variables, etc. Okay, it is always used to initialization purpose. Now we have declared one class student. Here there are two instance variables, roll number and class name. This is a constructor where we are defining only the name of the class and the blank parenthesis. That means it is a constructor. We are not defining any return type to this or any, if you are not defining any access specifier, it will default access specifier. Okay, and you are writing something here, the body of a constructor, that is nothing but whatever you want to initialize for this object, that you can write here in the constructor. Okay, this is a default constructor. In the main method, when we are creating any object, we are using after the new keyword, we are calling this constructor default constructor, nothing but it gets called here. The call gets here to this constructor, and whatever you are written into the body of a default constructor, that gets called. If you are not defining this constructor in a class, then as we have seen, JVM creates the default constructor with no arguments and it will get called automatically internally. Okay, this is the example of constructor. We are going to see practically. So before going for the practical, there are two types of constructor. First one is the no argument or default constructor. Second one is the parameterized constructor. You can write n number of constructors in a class as constructor overloading is allowed in a class. Constructor always have in the same class you have to define. You cannot define other classes constructor in another class. No, because the class always have, the constructor always have a name of a class. Okay, so no argument constructor or default constructor that has no parameter, or we say no arguments to the constructor. That is why it is known as default constructor. So we are going to create one class. In the module 8, we will create one class. Name of the class is constructor example. Okay. In this, I am creating main method as well. In the same Java file, I am going to create other class also. Suppose the class name is person. Class name person, and I want to define some properties of a person here. For example, string name, string email, string address. Okay, that's it. I want to define a person with all these properties. So basically, these are nothing but your instance variables. Now here we will create a default constructor with the name of a class itself, then no argument parameters, okay, and the body of a constructor. I will define here system.out.println. This is a default constructor. Constructor is called of person class. Okay. And I want to define some default values to these three instance variables as well. We want to construct an object, okay, of a person with some default values. By calling this default constructor, we can perform or we can give the values to these instance variables. Name is equals to, suppose I want to give some name. Some email address also. gmail.com. And some address. All are not compulsory. Okay, so if I want to give only default values to name and email itself, I don't want to give value to address, I can keep it blank itself. Okay, so this is a default constructor, or the first type of constructor you can say as default or no argument constructor. We are not passing any argument here. If you are defining this constructor, then you can call it directly while creating object. If you are not defining this constructor, the JVM calls default constructor like this. You are not defining this constructor, then JVM internally creates this constructor and calls it while creating or defining any, initializing any object. Okay. Now we are not specified any access specifier here. So the class level, sorry, the package level access specifier is there, that is default. Okay. You can change that to, you can add access specifiers. Allowed are public, protected, default. Okay. We use private constructors also, but very rare case, because constructors are basically used to construct an object. So if you are making this constructor as private, then you cannot call this constructor or you cannot construct an object using that constructor outside of that class, right? So that is why private constructors are in very rare case we use. If you are using the private constructor, then you have to create another constructor with any of these accessibility so that you can call this constructor in the another constructor to perform operations. How to call that we will see. Okay. So now we will create one person object. I'm calling the default constructor. Which is defined in the class itself. Okay, so this is defined in the class and it has the same name as the class name. It is bounded to the class itself. We cannot create another class's constructor in different class. Okay. Now, if I use system.out.println to display this, we will first generate the toString method to give the string representation of the object. Right click, generate toString method to display all the values of a person object, instance variables. Okay. We will use system.out.println statement. Person1 is equals to, I want to display all the values of P object, which I have assigned, or the values I have set defaultly for the name and email field, okay, for this object. Okay, we will execute this. You can see name and email is assigned as per the default values we have given into the default constructor, and address is null because we have not mentioned any default address for that. Okay, so whenever you are creating any object with the default constructor, these default values get set. So whenever you require to construct the object with some default values, you can use this type of declaration in your classes for the default constructor. Or whenever initializing any object, you want to perform some operations, you want to do some write down some code, then you can do that inside a constructor. Okay, that is the purpose of default constructor. This is the default constructor we have seen here. So if we are not creating any constructor in a class, then the compiler creates a default constructor for that class. Okay, if we are creating any constructor with arguments or default, then the compiler does not create. Remember this thing, because many students get confused. If we are writing a parameterized constructor in our class, then the compiler will never generate a default constructor. Okay, whatever the constructor you have defined in a class, that will be the class constructor itself. If you are not defining any constructor, no argument constructor और parameterized constructor दोनों में से कोई भी नहीं किया है, तो ही compiler default constructor generate करता है. Okay, so we have seen this default constructor. Now second type of constructor is parameterized constructor. So parameterized constructor, we can pass the parameters to the constructor. That is why we say that it is parameterized constructor. Use of parameterized constructor is to initialize the values to fields. Okay, we can provide the values to the parameterized constructors when we are creating an object. So the syntax for that is class name, parameters or arguments you want to pass to that constructor, and the body of the constructor. Okay, so mainly when we are writing any parameterized constructor, we use these fields for, because only instance variables or these fields will have a values for this person of class, right? That is why in a parameterized constructor, we use these fields. So the name of the class, person. You cannot write the same constructors. Okay, you can overload the constructors, but this is nothing but you are defining multiple constructor. That is the concept of constructor overloading. You can overload the constructors, but same as the methods, you have to change the signature. Okay, so already we have defined the default constructor. Second type of constructor we are defining here is parameterized constructor. This is parameterized constructor. Okay, same access specifiers for the parameterized constructor are also same. Private constructors, very rare case. Okay, so we want to pass some parameters. For example, I want to pass name and I want to initialize name and email address for any the object. Okay, I am giving some different variable names, string n and string e. Okay, n is for name and e is for email. Here, for this person object field name, I want to set a value which is we are receiving as a parameter n. तो मुझे नेम फील्ड के लिए जो n वेरिएबल की वैल्यू है वो सेट करनी है, एंड ईमेल फील्ड के लिए जो e वेरिएबल की वैल्यू है वो सेट करनी है. ठीक है, so this is a parameterized constructor. I am changing the accessibility for this is public. I am creating this parameterized constructor with public accessibility. Okay, so whatever the value we are passing here, that will get stored for that object's name field, and whatever value we are sending here as a parameter, that will get set to the email field of that object. Okay, so to call this constructor, we will use another object, person e1 is equals to new. After new, instead of this default constructor call, you can replace that with parameterized constructor by passing two string type of values. We are using string type, right? So we can pass two string type of values here. I am passing some values. Okay. So two string type of values when you are passing here, that means the compiler understands that this is a person constructor which has two string parameters, and the call will be, the compiler will call this constructor at the compilation time itself. This gets resolved at the compilation time itself to initialize the value, whatever the value you are sending. So for P1 object, we are giving the name and email field value. We are not assigning address field value also here, right? So if you want to set the address field value, you can use this pay also. Okay. So this P1 object we are using here, this is the calling parameterized constructor. Parameterized constructor with two string inputs, two string arguments or parameters, two string arguments, parameters, or you can say inputs also. Okay. So we are overloaded this constructor, and this is also the overloading constructor is also gets resolved at the compile time. This is overloading concept. That is why we can say overloading is always a compile time polymorphism. It gets resolved at the compilation time itself. So we will display system.out.println as we have already created the toString method. Person2 is equals to P1 object. I am combining here. Let's execute this. So you can see we have set the name and email by calling the default parameterized constructor, and we have used accessing the member of the class directly to set the address value. So that will also get assigned. So the values for the person1 object and person2 object will be different, and the memory allocations are also different. The constructor are also different. Here we are calling the default constructor. Here we have called the parameterized constructor. Okay, so you can see here while assigning the object, default constructor is called of a person class. You are getting that output. So I will add the same type of statement in the parameterized constructor also. System.out.println. I will add some lines also, so you will get clear output. Okay, so this is a default constructor called, and default value set for name and email field of person1 object, and parameterized constructor called of a person class. For person2 object, we are setting the Gitika and email address for using the parameterized constructor, and address we are setting using the directly filled value. I am removing this part to understand only the parameterized constructor part. Okay. So this is parameterized constructor. Any doubt till here? Anyone? Understood this constructor, default constructor and parameterized constructor? Clear or not? Okay, so you can define any number of constructor in your class. Okay, so we will define here next constructor. Okay, first we will see the use of this keyword. This is a constructor overloading. We have already seen that constructor overloading is a concept having a multiple constructors differentiated on the basis of number of parameters. Okay, number of parameters, type of parameters we are defining. We cannot use any other variables apart from your instance variables. Okay, so कंस्ट्रक्टर में हमेशा आपके इंस्टेंस ऑब्जेक्ट्स के इंस्टेंस वेरिएबल्स पे ही काम होता है. ऑलवेज कंस्ट्रक्टर हैज द मेंबर्स only as a parameter. Okay, we never use some other values apart from these because it is related to object initialization, right? So object always have these members. So we are going to create the constructors only on based on these members. Okay, so you can pass any number of parameters. On the basis of that parameters, you can perform or you can do the constructor overloading. The same example is here, the car default constructor, car with one string name, that is one parameterized constructor, car with string name, string make, two string parameters. This is a second parameterized constructor. This is a constructor overloading, same as a method overloading. Okay, now we are going to see the use of this keyword. Why we use this keyword in Java? So basically this keyword is always refers to the current object. Reference, this is a reference variable and it always refers to the current object. So we use this keyword multiple times and mostly in the constructors. Okay? In the constructor we use this keyword. Okay, so this can be used to refer the current class instance variables. Current classes instance variables, it always refers to the current object. This can be used to invoke current class method implicitly. This can be used to invoke current class constructor. This is a constructor. Okay, this is a constructor parenthesis. We will see that. This can be passed as an argument in the method call also. This can be passed as argument in the constructor call also. And this can be used to return the current class instance from a method. So these are the different usage of this keyword. But here we will see which is widely used, this keyword use. Okay. So as we have seen, this keyword is used to refer current object. Okay, to refer the current object. So current objects members, the members, nothing but the name, email, members. We want to refer those also. So how to define that, how to refer those? So here I am creating one protected person constructor with parameters, string name, string email. Okay, you cannot create the same constructor as we have already created with two string parameters. So I will add the third parameter also here, string address. Okay. Now this is a parameterized constructor. These parameters also have the same name as your instance variables or the members or the fields of a class, right? Same name as these members. So if you want to differentiate between this parameter variable name and the field name, we use this keyword. Okay, how to use that? So we will use this dot name is equals to name. That means it will assign the parameterized name variable value to the current object's name field, because using this we are referring current object. Okay, so whatever the current object is, that current object's name field is pointed. Currently we are referring to the name field of that current object, and we are setting the name variable parameter value to this field. Okay, so this is a variable or parameter and this is a field. Okay, we always say The instance variables are as fields also. We have already seen that, right? These are fields also. So we are assigning the value, assigning value of parameter name to the current object's name field. We are referring it using this keyword. Okay. Similarly, we will say this dot email is equals to email. This dot address is equals to address. So this is a parameter and this is field value. So current objects field value we are setting with the help from, we are getting the input here in these variables, local variables, and we are setting it to the instance variables. We are differentiating these two names using this keyword. Okay. So same, I will call second person parameterized constructor. I will add it here, parameterized constructor using parameterized constructor 2. This is just for your understanding. This keyword is called of person class. Here we will pass some other values. Okay. We need to pass the third parameter also. If we are passing only two parameters, then by default it will call the second constructor, right? But we want to call to the third constructor, parameterized constructor. So I will pass some value to third parameter also. Okay, I'm changing the object name to P2 person 3. Okay, this is a calling parameterized constructor with 3 string parameters. Okay, with 3 string parameters or 3 string arguments. You can say that. And I am displaying this run as Java application. So you can see parameterized constructor 2. This keyword is called of person class. Here we have passed 3 values to the constructor. So these 3 values are stored in appropriate variable. Name is stored in the name variable. Email is stored in the email variable. And address is stored into address variable. And these local variables, we are setting the values of these local variables to the objects fields. So now again, these gets assigned to the name field of person 2 object. Okay, person 3 object. So in this way, you can use different constructors. This is constructor overloading concept also. We are using this keyword to refer to the current object. We are using, as well as we are using this keyword to differentiate between the parameter name and class fields. Okay, here we have seen protected public and default accessibility for the constructor. We will see how to call the constructor using this keyword and how to use the private constructors also. Any doubt? Go through this example once. If you have any doubt, you can ask. If not, then we will see the next example. Protected is just the access specifier I have given. Okay. I am just explaining that we can give different access specifiers, the public, protected, and default. I have mentioned the default access specifier. So if you are using the default access specifier for the constructor, this constructor is accessed within the same package. You know that, right? Then if you are specifying the public as the constructor, then this public constructor can be accessed from anywhere, any package, from any class. If you are defining the constructor as a protected, then for the protected members, you can access this constructor within the same package or outside of a package if any child class of this person class you are defining in another package, then only this constructor is accessed. Okay. So all the accessibility, we have already seen the accessibility part. Same accessibility is for the constructors here. Clear? It is not compulsory. If you are using these keywords and these members, then you have to mention or you have to define that constructor as protected. No, it is up to you which accessibility you want to give. Okay. It is up to your requirement. But as I said, private constructors are very rare, because if you are using private to any member, then the accessibility of that private member is only within the class, right? So that's why, and we are using the constructors to create objects, to initialize the objects. The main purpose is for creating constructors is nothing but you want to give some initialization value, you want to perform some initialization task, then there is no point of creating the constructor as private. But I will show you how the private constructors work. Okay, understood. Any more doubts? Anyone? Shall we go ahead? So here we have created 3 different objects. So in the same person class, we will create private constructor and we will see how to call constructor using this keyword. Okay. So here I am creating a private constructor person with a single parameter string name. You cannot create the same constructor. If you want to create a private constructor with default accessibility, you cannot do that because we have already defined the constructor, default constructor with the default accessibility. Okay. So if you are using the overloading concept, then you must differentiate between the parameters. We have already created with 2 parameters. We have already created a constructor with 3 parameters. That is why I'm creating with a single parameter. Okay. Now, this is a private constructor. As you can see here, the constructor person is never used locally because if you are creating a person constructor as a private, you have to call this constructor okay. So what we will do, we will use this keyword to set the value to the field name, which is a parameter name. Now, if we are not going to call this, if I am trying to do person p3 is equals to new, person and I am passing one value here. Okay, then it will not call the private constructor because you can see here change the visibility of person to package. Package is nothing but default. Okay, we cannot call this with a single string parameter. We cannot call the private constructor outside of the class. Then what is the point of creating this constructor? What is the point of giving the parameter to this? We cannot set the values, right? So what we will do, we will change this name. Okay, this is, we have already seen the use of this. Okay, now if we want to set the name variable value and we need to call this person constructor also, then we can use this keyword to call the constructor. Okay, what we will do, we will see in the another example because it will create the unnecessary here. I will remove the private constructor. We'll create another class. In the same example, I will create another class. Here the class name is vehicle. I am creating private constructor vehicle. The members of this are suppose string name, string color. Okay, two members are there in the vehicle class. These are fields we have defined in the class vehicle. So the private constructor vehicle is taking one parameter, string name. Okay, string name, and here we will set that using this keyword, this dot name is equals to name variable. Okay, this we have already seen. This is a private constructor with single parameter. I am not defining the default constructor here. Okay, now I am going to define the parameterized constructor with two fields. So parameterized constructor, you can generate the constructors also in a class. So to do that, you can use source, right click, go to the source, and here you can generate the constructor using fields. If you are using fields, then the parameterized constructor gets created. And if you are using the super class, then the default constructor gets created. So I'm using with fields. So you can select the fields. I want both. Okay. Now, instead of this name, what I will do, we can set this variable value name. We have already one constructor with a string parameter, one string parameter, right? So instead of using this statement is already written here. We will call this constructor using this. So whenever you are calling this constructor, you can pass the name variable here. Okay, so in this will call the private constructor vehicle with the string name parameter. It will set the value to the current object's name field, and here you are setting the value to the color field. Okay, so here I am showing you the parameterized constructor calling using this. You can call the default constructor also if you are defining here, and it is not compulsory that that constructor should be of private accessibility only. You can use the other constructors also. ठीक है, मतलब कि वो कंस्ट्रक्टर आपका प्राइवेट ही होना चाहिए दिस कीवर्ड से आपको कॉल करना है तो नहीं, दैट इज नॉट नेसेसरी. You can call any constructor using this keyword. Okay, I am showing you both combined in the same class, private constructor also and calling of a constructor using this keyword. ठीक है, मैंने यहाँ पे एक ही एग्जांपल में एक्सप्लेन किया है. So this is nothing but calling a constructor, calling a private constructor with one string parameter using this keyword. So whatever the value we are getting here, as it is, I am passing that variable value to the constructor. So that value again get copied to this constructor's variable name, and then it will set to the current object's name field. Okay. So यहाँ पे आप कोई भी default constructor भी call कर सकते हो, parameterized constructor call कर सकते हो, anything. It is not compulsory. It should be private. Okay. The compulsion is that if you are creating a private constructor, then you have to call that constructor public in a public or any other accessibility constructor, because we cannot access the private constructors outside of the class. Okay, so I will generate the toString method also here. We will create one vehicle object. Vehicle v is equals to new vehicle. Now here we have not defined the default constructor. We have only defined one parameterized constructor. Okay, so if you are defining the parameterized constructor, then the compiler will never generate the default constructor and you cannot call to the default constructor. Okay, the matching constructor is not there. Okay, is undefined because we have defined the constructor which is a parameterized. अगर आपने कोई भी constructor define नहीं किया है तो ही compiler generate करता है default constructor. So I'm giving some name, that is Honda, and some color white. Okay, we will display the values system.out.println vehicle1 is equals to v. So we will get the value set, the name and color. Okay. Internally, it will call the private constructor to set the vehicle's name field value. Okay. And then the color field value we are setting here into the parameterized constructor itself. Okay. If you are creating only the private default constructor in your class, then that class is called as singleton class. Singleton class if the class has only one default private constructor. Okay, default private constructor. If that class has only one default private constructor, that class is known as singleton class. You cannot create the object of that. Create object of that class. Okay, we have to create one static object, or the compiler will generate one static object, and that is shared among all the GVM classes. Okay, so all the classes share a single object created that is known as a singleton pattern. Okay, so the singleton class is nothing but if the class has only one default private constructor, then you cannot create the object of that class. That is a singleton class. We have one singleton class defined. There is a collection. Class name is collections. Okay, so this is a public class collections. It has one default private constructor. Okay, so you cannot create the object of this class. It is the class object is already created and we are only using that. Okay, so this is a singleton pattern class or singleton class. Okay. Clear? I will write down here. Example is collections class. Understood? How to write down the private constructor. So if you are writing a private constructor, then you have to call that constructor with any other accessibility. Or if you don't want to do that, then you have to make that class as a singleton class. Then you can perform these operations. Okay, so you cannot create the object of that class, but you have to do some basically do some creation of objects, static objects, so that that object will be shared among all classes. Okay, so whenever you require, you can use that one object itself. That is known as singleton design pattern. Go through this part once and let me know if you want to, if you have any doubts. So similarly, you can use this keyword to call the instance methods also. Okay, if you have any instance methods, then you can use this keyword to call the instance methods also. Understood? Clear? All the concepts of related to the constructor. Okay, constructor, default constructor, parameterized constructor, constructor overloading concept, then the this keyword. Then we have seen private constructors, how to use this keyword to call the constructors. And if you're making only one default private constructor in a class, then that class is a singleton class. It has to, you cannot create object of that class. You have to create one static object. This is singleton design pattern. Yes, but with the name of the class itself. That we will see in the inheritance concept. You cannot write another class's constructors, right? Constructors always have the same name as the class name. So here, if I am creating the vehicle class constructor, I cannot write this vehicle class constructor here in the person class. Okay, because constructors always have same name as the class name. Clear? Now, in the same manner, we will generate constructors in our object array book class, right? As I said, we will add the concepts when we learn the concepts of constructor and getter setter methods, we will add those here. So you can generate the constructors using the source, generate using the superclass, generate as default superclass is object itself. So that is nothing but whenever you are creating the constructor using superclass, it generates the default constructor, and source constructor using fills, and I am generating here using fills. Okay, all fills in the same manner. Okay, if you want to change the sequence, you can do that also. If you want to reduce the fills, you can do that also. Okay, but for this example, I need two constructors. One is parameterized constructor and second one is default constructor. So for the default constructor, I'm going to set the values to this fills, which are default. Book ID is equals to 101. This dot book name is equals to Java programming. Not necessarily you need to do this, but I want to give some default values to all these fields. That's why I'm doing this. Okay. Compulsory nahi hai. You can keep the default constructor blank as well. And last one is price. This dot price is equals to okay. So I have assigned all the default values to one object, which is whenever we are creating any object of this book class using default constructor, these default values get set for those, right? And this is a parameterized constructor where we are providing some inputs to this constructor and we are setting those values to the fields of a book class. Yeah, so these are instance variables. These two are constructors. Here we have overloaded the constructor with default and parameterized. Clear? We have already generated the toString method. Add these things in your this object array small project also. Okay, clear? Anyone has any doubt? Okay. Then for today we will stop here itself, and tomorrow we will see what are the static keyword, what is static keyword, where to use the static keywords. Okay. Thank you everyone. You may leave. I will share the all Java files once tomorrow's session will end. I will share all the files tomorrow in a WhatsApp group. Thank you everyone. You may leave. So you may end the session.